Okay, you guys, we're going to give this video here a try. So today we're going to be talking about the zero product property. Nothing too challenging. Zero means obviously zero, product meaning multiplication. And we've talked about this before this year. So if we're multiplying two numbers here to get zero, you know that at least one of those numbers has to be zero. So either this question mark is going to be zero, or this question mark is going to be zero, or both of them are going to be zero. So notice before you were factoring, there were never any equal signs. You were just simplifying by factoring. Now you're going to start to notice that we have an equal sign, which tells us that we're actually going to be solving. So what if we had this, like this example? What if I have x times y equals 0? It's the exact same thing as up above with the two question marks. It's just now instead of the question marks, we have two different variables. So if I asked you to solve for x and y, I know that either x could equal 0 or y could equal 0. So this right here would actually be your answer if you were told to solve. So if we go down below a little bit further here, let's take a look at this. Again, notice it's equal to 0. So again, the directions would tell you to solve. It's the exact same thing as up above. It's just now instead of having a single variable like the x or the y, we now have addition or subtraction with it. So if the directions asked you to solve for x, you know that this entire quantity in this parenthesis, because it's all equal to 0, this entire quantity right here could equal 0. So you'll see from that then we can go down here and we can make an equation that x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, if the direction said to solve, obviously I need to get x by itself. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides and get that x equals 2. That takes care of the first parenthesis. Well, we have our second parenthesis here. I also need to know what this x value could be. So this entire parenthesis could equal 0 as well. So you'll see here we can make another equation with that. X plus 7 could equal 0. So if I solve for x here, I'm going to subtract 7. So x equals negative 7. So these would both be my answer in this case. So this is called the zero product property. Because it's equal to 0, that's where the 0 is coming from. Product is because of the multiplication. And it says if the product is 0, you know at least one of the factors has to be 0. So let's take a look at a few more examples here where we actually have to solve for x. So the directions don't say it, but what the directions would actually tell you here is that you would have to be solving for x. So this is already factored for us over here on the left-hand side. I see an x and I see another x. Because there are two x's, that's a good way to know that, okay, I'm going to have two different x answers. So let's just deal with this first parenthesis here. Again, we're multiplying two numbers to get 0. So I know that one of these quantities has to be 0. So let's work with this first parenthesis here. So I know x minus 9 could be 0. Well, if the directions say to solve for x, I have to get x by itself. So let's add 9 to both sides. So x is equal to 9. That would make this entire parenthesis 0. Well, let's take a look at this next parenthesis. This could also be 0. So I'm going to make another equation. 3x minus 8 equals 0. And again, I'm going to solve for x. Add 8 to both sides. Divide by 3. So I get x is equal to 8/3. So again, I'm going to have two answers here for x. So the difference between what you were doing with factoring and what we're doing now is that now we have this equal sign here, which tells us to actually go in the next step and solve for what x is. So let's just double check. If I plug in 9 up here, I get 9 minus 9, which is 0. And then I get 3 times 9, which is 27. And 27 take away 8 is 19. Is 0 times 19 0? Yep. Now, if I go and plug in 8/3, I don't get 0 in the first parenthesis. But when I plug in 8/3 in the second parenthesis, I get 0. So I have whatever number I'd get there in the first parenthesis, we'll just put a question mark, times 0 would again give me 0. So we have 2 answers there for example 1. Example 2, let's take a look at that one. So hopefully you're looking at this and you're seeing, oh, we have 3 x's now. There's an x here, there's an x here, and there's an x here. So that tells me then that I'm going to have 3 different answers here. So I'm multiplying, because I'm multiplying 3 different quantities to get 0. So we're going to look at each one of those individually. I know that this entire quantity out here could be 0. So negative 2x equals 0. I'm going to get x by itself and get 0. So 0 in this case is actually an answer. The second parenthesis, I know that whole quantity could be 0. Again, I can make another equation. And please show this work. Most of the time, this is where people make their silly mistakes. So take the extra few seconds and show your work. So with this, I see that x is equal to 2. And then I have x in another parenthesis. So let's look at that one. 9x plus 12 equals 0. Subtract 12. Divide by 9. And x, and I would just keep it improper. Don't change it to a mixed number. They're both divisible by 3, so it'd become negative 4/3. So again, in this case, we have 3 different answers. So, moving on. Let's take a look at this next example. Some of you may be thinking at this point, well, okay, this isn't very hard. I just don't get the point of it. Why, this isn't challenging and we're just solving for x, but what's the point? So let's take a look at the next example. Like I said, take a look at example 3 there. You'll notice again it's equal to 0, so the directions are telling me to solve. But as we talked about up above, because we had x 3 different times or 2 different times, that decided how many answers we had. But if you take a look at example 1 and example 2, you notice that all of the x's are raised to the first power. Well, then when you go and you look down here at example 3, are all of the x's raised to the first power? Well, I hope you're saying no, because take a look at this. We have an x squared now. So we have a x squared and we have an x together at the same time. So that's what makes it a little bit funky here. Now, 2 weeks ago, had I given you x squared plus 6x plus 8, and I told you to factor it, you would be able to do that. So what do you think we can do with this entire left-hand side? Keeping in mind it's the 0 product property. Well, I have all this addition in here. I don't have any multiplication. So how can I rewrite this left side with multiplication? I hope what you're thinking is, oh, we can just factor it. just like we did on that quiz that we took. So let's factor the left-hand side of this. Now, whether you use the rectangle method or the regrouping method, you do whatever you prefer. I'm going to show it with the regrouping method. So technically there's a coefficient out here of 1. So 1 times 8, that would give me 8. So I need the factors of 8 that add up to 6. All right, so I'm going to do x squared. That would be 4x and 2x. And then I still have that plus 8 equals 0. So with the regrouping, I'm going to put in my parentheses. This part is nothing different than what you've been doing. So I take the x out of that first parenthesis. I have x plus 4. I take a positive 2 out of that parenthesis. And again, I have x plus 4 left. Notice both the parentheses are the same. If you're doing this and you're not getting that same parenthesis, that's a good sign that you made a mistake somewhere. So they both have an x plus 4 in them, so I'll take that out. And then I'm left with that x plus 2. And that equals 0. Notice how I brought that equals 0 down each time. So if you look at it from this point right here, this is showing you exactly what we were given up above. So now from here, I know that I'm multiplying two quantities now to get 0. So this parenthesis could be 0. So there's one answer. X could be negative 4, or this parenthesis here could be 0. In that case, I would get x equals negative 2. So I have two different answers here. One way to think of it is if it's squared, if you have a squared term, you're going to have two different answers. Now, if you wanted to double check both of those answers, you could plug both of those back in and you would see that it would make it true. But for time's sake, I'm not going to show that. Okay, let's take a look at the next example. So here, first of all, again, notice it's equal to 0. There is no multiplication like we had in example 3, but this one's a little funky because it's only a binomial, so there's only two terms over here on the left-hand side. So we can't do the factoring with the regrouping or with the rectangle method. So the next thing we need to do is look, is there a greatest common factor? Well, let's look at the coefficients, 2 and 12. So this one has a 2 that they're both divisible by, and they're also both divisible by an x. So if I take out 2x out of both terms, or divide them both by 2x, I'm left with x minus 6, and that equals 0. All right, we are back to the zero product property again. We have our multiplication. So I know that this could be 0. And again, I get an answer of x equals 0. Or this entire quantity here could be 0. So I'm going to add 6 to both sides and get x equals 6. So I would have two answers here. Again, it's squared, so I know I have two answers. Let's take a look at example 5. The first thing that I notice is that it's not equal to 0. That's okay. You can make it equal to 0 very easily. So let's add the 12x to both sides to get it equal to 0. The next thing, let's take a look at it and see if we have a greatest common factor. There has to be a greatest common factor because there's something cubed here and they all have an x in them. So I know I can take out an x. Well, let's look at the coefficients. What are 8, 28, and 12 all divisible by? Right, 4. So my greatest common factor here is 4. So if I take a 4 out, I'm left with 2x squared plus 7x plus 3 equals 0. Well, just like before,